Hello, everybody. This is Morning Jim Poetry with the not so famous poet Jim Ransom leading us astray, or just maybe along the way. Those two words rhyme, but I won't pick a favorite. Anyway, this is the program for September 12th. And last week, I got justifiably, I would say, criticized for not including George Gordon Lord Byron in the list of English Romantic poets, because, of course, he was one of the most outstanding and famous ones at the time. But as poetry became a little bit more well-behaved and serious in the Victorian era, we had other poets who sort of overshadowed Byron, and for that matter, some of the other romantics. And we'll touch on those in future sessions. But nothing I can say would ever take George Gordon Lord Byron off the list, and I think I should have included him, but there is a problem with Byron's poetry. He wrote very few short poems, he was a master of long narrative poetry, like Don Juan, not Don Juan, but you can tell from the rhyming in his poem, he pronounced it Don Juan. Anyway, I'm not going to read that. Or Prisoner of Chillon, or Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. These are book-length long poems. And our specialty here are the short poems. So I have found some of those too. And I've picked several pieces that are shorter, but they still give a good view of Byron's romanticism. And let's start out with She Walks in Beauty. She walks in beauty. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. Now, any young lady that spent much time with George Gordon and with whom he was in love would not be innocent very long. But I'm not going to go into that right now, except to say that Marcia and I took a tour, or better, it would be better to say we visited on a trip to England. And we were in Derbyshire visiting friends, and we visited Newstead Abbey his youthful home. Newstead Abbey is called an abbey because it was built in medieval times and then converted to a stately home after Henry VIII drove out the Catholic establishment and foreclosed on much of their wealth, which he wisely doled out to his followers, including Lord Byron's ancestors. It's a kind of spooky place, I thought. And he became a kind of spooky poet in some ways. In Newstead Abbey, we were told that Byron frequently looked out the windows of his living quarters, which are on the second floor of the castle or abbey, and he could see the bones of the medieval monks protruding through the garden soil after a rain, for example, because that was at one time the graveyard for the victims of the Black Death. And that's a little spooky. The place spooked me a little bit from then on when I heard about that. So, in addition to She Walks in Beauty, there's another short poem of his that I thought was worth reading, and that's a song really from one of his poems. It's called So We'll Go No More a Roving. So we'll go no more a roving so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving and the moon be still as bright. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul wears out the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself have rest. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go no more a roving by the light of the moon. I'm sure that has been put to music, and it's probably a lovely ballad. Now, there's another interesting story about Lord Byron, and also a poem to go with it. And that is, he once imported a pet, which was a Newfoundland dog. I think that would have been fairly early on in the course of the fame of the Newfoundland. And it was written in 1808 in honor of his Newfoundland dog, Bosun, spelled boatswain, as you probably know. Bosun, who had just died of rabies. When Bosun contracted the disease, Byron reportedly nursed the dog tenderly, without any fear of becoming bitten or infected. And in fact, he was not infected. The poem is inscribed on Bosun's tomb, which is larger than Byron's. And it's also at Newstead Abbey. I've seen a picture of it, and I may have seen the actual memorial monument when I was there, but I don't recall for sure about that. The poem is often printed with a memorial eulogy to Bosun, which introduced the poem, and they were not written by Byron, although sometimes that is suppose, but it wasn't Byron, but by his friend John Hobhouse. A letter of 1830 by Hobhouse suggests that Byron had planned to use the last two lines of his poem by way of an introductory inscription, but found he preferred Hobhouse's comparison of the attributes of dogs and people. So I'm going to include that in this reading, and I'll call your attention to what part is Hobhouse's and which part is Byron's when we get to it. Near this spot are deposited the remains of one who possessed beauty without vanity, strength without insolence, courage without ferocity, and all the virtues of man without his vices. This praise, which would be unmeaning flattery if inscribed over human ashes, is but a just tribute to the memory of Bosun, a dog who was born in Newfoundland, May 1803, and died at Newstead, November 18th, 1808. Now, here's the tribute that Byron wrote for Bosun. When some proud son of man returns to earth, unknown to glory but upheld by birth, the sculptor's art exhausts the pomp of woe, and storied urns record who rests below. When all is done, upon the tomb is seen not what he was, but what he should have been. But the poor dog, in life, the firmest friend, the first to welcome, foremost to defend, whose honest heart is still his master's own, who labors, fights, lives, breathes for him alone, unhonored falls. Unnoticed all his worth, denied in heaven the soul he held on earth. While man, vain insect, hopes to be forgiven and claims himself a soul-exclusive heaven, O man, thou feeble tenant of an hour, debased by slavery or corrupt by power, who knows thee well must quit thee with disgust. Degraded mass of animated dust, thy love is lust, thy friendship all a cheat, thy tongue hypocrisy, thy heart deceit. By nature vile, ennobled but by name, each kindred brute might bid thee blush for shame. Ye who behold perchance this simple urn, pass on. It honors none you wish to mourn. To mark a friend's remains, these stones arise. I never knew but one, and here he lies. That is certainly these are the words of a man who's truly sorry about the loss of his dog. Okay, we'll move on from Lord Byron, who has a much-deserved fame in English romantic poetry. And I'm so sorry I left him out last week, but I simply didn't have time to include him, given the difficulty of giving him his due, which I may still not have done in today's reading. But it struck me as I was researching and reading about Byron, how similar in some respects he was to Dylan Thomas, a much more modern poet who was really a romantic poet. He was so unique in his poetry that he was not actually classified as a romantic poet, but he probably should be. Reading his poems really and promptly recalls much of the beauty and romanticism of the 19th century, but they were written with a new vocabulary in the 20th century. And I'm going to start out, if I can find it here. Here's my book of Dylan Thomas's collected poems. And I have a lot of bookmarks in this book, I must tell you that, because I'm a big fan of Dylan Thomas. Oops, I'm losing my solid ground here with my, sorry about that, with my, yeah, there we go. We've got this poor, overmanned, old-fashioned little pad propped up with several books and so forth. And I hope it doesn't collapse completely before I'm through with this poem. This one is a famous one. I'm sure most of you who have an existing contact with poetry will know Fern Hill. Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail, and climb golden in the heydays of his eyes, and honored among wagons I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home in the sun that is young once only. Time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means, and green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running. It was lovely. The hayfields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys. It was air and playing, lovely and watery and fire, green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm, like a wanderer white with the dew, came back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable on to the fields of praise. And honored among foxes and pheasants lay the gay house under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long. In the sun, born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house-high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades, that time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-throng loft by the shadow of my hand in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. That's a very moving and wonderful, brilliant poem. You can visualize the hills and dales of Wales, wherein Dylan Thomas played as a child. Sadly scarred perhaps by the bombing of London, where he worked during World War II, Thomas could not leave strong drink alone. Even before his days of fame, he had to be taken away by his close friends from time to time and dried out. After the war, he made several trips to the United States for poetry readings, where his worst desires were readily catered to. He died of alcohol poisoning after a party at New York's White Horse Tavern at age 39. And he is said to have consumed his 18th dose of Scotch whiskey. Let that be a lesson for us all. I have long wondered what poetry he might have produced had he been more abstemious. And instead of dying at age 39, lived to a ripe old age, but that was not to be. By the way, another 20th century poet whom we have heard from before and who's one of my favorites, he's an American poet, John Crow Ransom of Kenyon College. No relative of mine, I'm sorry to say. But he could easily be classified as a Romantic poet or a continuation of the Romantic era, in my opinion, along with Dylan Thomas. Well, we've gone past 20 minutes, which is unusually long for one of these sessions, and for that, too, I apologize. But I hope those of you who have a thing for Lord Byron will now forgive me from leaving him out of the Romantic era that we explored last week. Okay, I'm heading off to Scotland now. Maybe I'll be inspired for some more poetry readings of a different type. But I will miss next week's session with you, since I'll be out of the country still at that time. But you'll be busy getting ready for Thanksgiving and maybe even Christmas. You won't miss me as much as I'll miss you. Bye now.